So the domestic season has ended and there will be no European football for Eddie Howe and his team next season because Manchester United won the FA Cup. They beat Manchester City 2-1 at Wembley, and that means that Newcastle miss out on a place in the Conference League next season because Manchester United, who finished 8th, remember, get the Europa League slot, and Chelsea fall into that Conference League spot. But what is that going to mean for us next season? Let's get into it. Obviously, first of all, it's actually really disappointing that we didn't manage to get European football. It's a big blow to the club, and really having back-to-back seasons in European football would have been an absolutely brilliant sign that this project was moving in the right direction. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened, and we only have ourselves to blame. At the end of the day, yes, we needed Manchester City to win, but you should never be relying on other clubs to do you a favour, even if they're as good as Manchester City are, because we left points out on the field this season, despite all the injuries. We know the context behind that, but the injuries only give us so much of an out. There's definitely games where we've left points out there where we should have done better. Let's look at the last week of the season for a start. We drew with Brighton at home, and then we went to Manchester United and just weren't at the races. And actually, we should have been. We should have actually, if we'd just beaten Manchester United, we wouldn't be in this situation. And we were playing a Manchester United side who weren't good and that haven't been good this season and were struggling a bit. And then they suddenly put in a performance against us. Why? Because in part we let them, and that's where the disappointment comes. So you could point to those two games. You could also point to the two games against Luton Town, a relegated team. Again, how many seasons have we given a relegated team 4 points in a Premier League season? We did it again this season. And I'm sorry, but if your aim is to finish in the top 4 or the top 6, you shouldn't be dropping that many points to a team like Luton, even if they were having a good run at the time. You just have to find a way to get those results. Then there's Forest at home, Everton's late equaliser at home. There's so many different moments in the season where we could have just done ourselves a little bit better, but have sort of crumbled at key moments. But I just think if you've got the ambitions we've got, you have to make sure that you're not dropping those late points. The amount of points we've dropped late on in games. Liverpool at home as well, of course. Let's not forget that. We were there. We had the game. We had it won. And yet we somehow didn't just draw it. We lost it. Maybe that's something that needs to be looked at and addressed as well this summer by Eddie Howe and his coaching staff about how we finish games as well, because there's been too many late points thrown away. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit the like button. That really helps spread the video to other people. Thank you. Getting away from the disappointment, in practical terms for next season, what it actually means is there's no midweek games, or very few midweek games. There's no Thursday and Sunday schedule, which would have been the case if they had been playing in the Conference League. That's a small positive. I'd rather have that than not have it personally, because I'd rather be in Europe than not, especially with where we want the club to go. But it does give us an advantage when it comes to the Premier League season. We know that from last season when we didn't have European football either, and we could just focus on the league stuff. It really benefited us, especially towards the end of the season. And for me personally, I believe that finishing in the top 4 is the absolute main priority next season. We have to get back into the Champions League next season because we need to keep really good players and attract really good players. And I think you do that in the Champions League. So we have to get back there. We can kind of point to this season as being a bit of an anomaly. Will Bruno and Isak stay or go? We don't know that, especially now we're not in the European competitions, but we'll see what the situation is with them two. But going forward, we have to get back into Europe next season. But again, I think where we have our sights, I don't think qualifying for the Europa League next season would be good enough, in my opinion. I think it has to be a top 4 finish back in the Champions League. And we need to look at the domestic cups and give ourselves an absolute brilliant shot of actually winning one of them. We have to get over this hurdle of winning a trophy. We have to do that. And I know, in a sense, cups are a bit of a lottery. You know, you could get a hard away draw or whatever. But you see Man United beat Man City at Wembley in the biggest of occasions today. And Man United are not as good as Man City. And yet they did it. As a club, we need to overcome this. We have to start backing ourselves and believing that we are good enough and worthy enough to actually win one of these trophies. And next season, I think top 4 for me is more important than a trophy next season, but I think they're very, very close together. And I want to see us try and do both things next season. And if we can keep the squad together, bring in a couple more additions, we'll be in a great place. Again, we'll talk about that as we go through the summer, whether we can keep Bruno and Isak in particular. The focus next season is massive, and I really, really believe the pressure really is on Eddie Howe next season. And I think if he falls short of the top 4, he'll be gone. And if we get knocked out in the early stages of cup competitions, then I believe that would also put his job in jeopardy next season too. Also, just worth noting that we will actually now have to enter the League Cup at the round 2 stage rather than the round 3 stage because we're not in Europe. Now, as far as the planning goes for the club, I think they've had planning in place for all sorts of scenarios, finishing in the Europa League, finishing in the Conference League, and finishing without Europe. So I think they've got plans and budgets for each of those things. But of course, we're now in the worst case scenario in that respect because we don't have Europe. So that means the budget's going to be a bit lower. Things might be a bit tighter. Can we get rid of some of the kind of deadwood of the squad a little bit? Like, we probably don't need to keep Paul Dummett around now that we're not in Europe next season for quota things. And I think there's got to be a question mark about whether Matt Ritchie goes as well. There may be others. You know, selling Longstaff might become more of a feasible thing to do as well. I think it puts his future at Newcastle in more risk not being in Europe. So, because we might cash in, and obviously everything we get from Longstaff would be a profit. It's just whether there's a big market or any market for Sean Longstaff at the moment. We'll see what happens with that, but it does leave us in a bit of a vulnerable position, as I said, again, with Bruno and Isak. I think it leaves us more vulnerable to losing one of them, if not both. I hope they can kind of see that this season was a little bit of an anomaly in a sense, and that they might hopefully stick around. It might be out of our hands now if big offers come in, like we might not be able to turn them down. The commercial revenue and stuff of the club is still growing, and as we know, there's still spending rules in place that we have to stick to and adhere to and all that kind of stuff. And without Europe, even if it was Conference League where the money's a lot smaller, it's still lost. It's still a lost revenue stream for next season, so that puts more pressure on the finances. It's not ideal. It's going to be I mean, this summer was always going to be interesting anyway, but it's going to be more interesting now because things are, like I said, it's worst case scenario in terms of what we wanted at the start of the season. To end up with no European football, it's not great, really. And again, there's been context, but ultimately it's very, very disappointing to miss out on Europe, and I think it's not a good thing for the club. I don't think, and I know there's a train of thought where some fans believe that not playing Europe next season will be beneficial, and I do get that point of view because schedule-wise it's going to make our life easier, but in the wider context of the club, I just think it's a massive, massive opportunity missed, and we only have ourselves to blame.